Hi, it's Ileana. So, I found something very interesting. I did a little bit more research on Alexander the Great, and I found that he is part Illyrian, and that's an Albanian nationality, that the Illyrian tribes had come from Macedonia. So, Alexander the Great is Illyrian, he is Macedonian, and Greek. Those are his three nationalities. Philip II, his father, and Olympias, his mother, were Illyrian. So the origins of Illyrians is the ancient Albanian tribes that were in Macedonia, that were the heart of Macedonia. So that is what I found out through some research into Alexander's parents and him and the nationalities. So he is Illyrian, which is coming from the Albanian tribes, Macedonian, and Greek. So that's the historical record of his nationality. And Zagor crystals, new ethnicity DNA test results updates show that Zagor crystal is 2% Greek from Greece, Northern Macedonia, and Albania. When I had a closer look at the test results, it also said Albania. And I'm like, is Alexander the Great connected to Albania in any way? And he's Illyrian. So, and Illyrians are again ancient Albanian tribes coming from Macedonia. So that's another interesting little point that I just learned. So again, this adds an interesting factor to Zagor crystals' DNA changing. Since me and Zagor, of course, had gone into Alexander the Great's tomb, and we had explored it, we had studied Alexander's genetics. So this is fascinating. And to find out that Alexander the Great has Arcturian DNA and Syrian DNA is amazing. By writing his genetic frequency in his DNA, to see that he was indeed genetically engineered and modified, and that he always claimed to be the son of Zeus, because that's what his mother told him, that she had a dream of being with a snake-like being, and that lightning struck her from Zeus's thunderbolts, and that Zeus is his true father. And also, being physically conceived by Philip II. So supposedly Alexander had two fathers, Philip II and Zeus, the demigod side of him. So I do think that there's some truth that, again, Alexander the Great was genetically modified by extraterrestrials, Arcturians and Syrians. That's what it shows in his blood, in his genetics. So in terms of Zeus fathering him and being a demigod, that's interesting information. But again, I believe what gods are is extraterrestrials. Same with demigods. Those were the mythical explanations to explain something unaccountable for. That wasn't easy to explain in those times. Now it's much easier to explain what gods are, what deities are, demigods. They're just beings like us, just maybe on a higher dimensional scale, more advanced civilizations, but they're certainly multidimensional or extraterrestrial. There's more scientific ways of explaining otherworldly things beyond just calling them gods or goddesses or deities or demigods. So we have reached the capacity to have better explanations for these beings. So it was interesting to see again that Alexander the Great also has Albanian historical connections, like genetically, with nationality. I did not expect to find that as results, but I did. So that genetic update in Zagor Crystal's DNA, because he is a conduit for DNA transference and DNA upgrades, apparently. That to me was surprising to find out, because again, you have to be of Earth origin, having an Earth lifetime, for your genetics to actually change if you've done 2 DNA tests that are the same person before channeling and during channeling. Yeah, it's not the same person when you're channeling, but the DNA remains the same if you're channeling an extraterrestrial, because they've probably never had an Earth lifetime before. They're not of Earth origin, so they don't have Earth DNA, like specific nationality of where they were born. Like again, Alexander the Great was born in Pella, Macedonia. He's Illyrian, Albanian, and Illyrians, Albanians are from Macedonia, the tribes. So clearly his nationality, that 2% DNA upgrade that Zagor got, that's Alexander the Great's 2% DNA from his ethnic origins of where he was born. So that explains that, again, when channeling somebody, it's important to have an Earth lifetime of who you're channeling for the DNA to actually change. And because Zagor and I had touched Alexander the Great's stasis pod and traveled in his DNA to see the percentages, and again, it's almost like, again, something like 27% Arcturian and 30% Syrian DNA. That was the percentage breakdowns approximately, and the rest is human, what Zagor and I discovered in Alexander's DNA results when scanning the frequencies and energetics of his DNA. But we literally, it's like touching Alexander the Great's body. That's how DNA got transferred over to Zagor. Plus, it could have had something to do with me channeling Alexander the Great quite a bit and psychically communicating with him for the last couple of months. So that may have strengthened the DNA transference. But again, we rode Alexander the Great's genetics. We energetically rode the genes, the DNA, the frequencies of it. And I think that's what caused the DNA transference to Zagor Crystal, who has my DNA, my Earth DNA. There was no trace of Zagor's original DNA being picked up by Ancestry, because it doesn't have the capacity to pick up ET genetics. That technology is available in the Black Ops programs on Earth, but it's not available to the public, to the general public who are doing DNA tests. We as the public don't have the capacity to distinguish ET DNA from human DNA. If you do DNA testing with Ancestry or any other ethnicity DNA test kits, you're going to get human DNA, Ancestry of where you were born and where you came from. It's going to tell you your origins breakdowns. So again, it's interesting that Zagor was the conduit for the DNA transference, and it was Alexander the Great's DNA being transferred to Zagor Crystal, because Alexander the Great had a human lifetime on Earth. So that seems to be the critical point. of this kind of an experiment working. It has to be Earth DNA and somebody who was earthbound at one point to be channeled. I think that's part of the foundation for this to work, for that kind of an experiment. I had a look at my parents' profiles of genetic ethnic inheritances, and my mom is Eastern Europe and Russia. She's 43%, and my dad is Jewish peoples of Europe, 50%, and then the Baltics, we have 6%, and the Balkans, about 2% for my parents. And my mother has passed on to me the Eastern European and Russian genetics, and my dad the predominantly Jewish genetics, and a bit of the Baltics and the Balkans. So that's my LK kind of DNA breakdown, ethnicity breakdown. The Zagor crystal DNA breakdown is actually 50% Jewish from my dad and 42% Eastern Europe and Russia from my mom, Baltics 6%, and then you have the Greece, Northern Macedonia, and Albania 2% from my parents, which is impossible because they don't have any Greek DNA in them, and neither do I, but it got passed down to Zagor crystal. When I did the DNA testing with the 2 DNA kits for the trans-channeling experiment with Grant Cameron, my DNA, both DNA kits, was to test human DNA to see if it would change. We don't currently have any technology on the surface of the planet to test for extraterrestrial DNA. Ancestry doesn't test for that. It only tests for Earth ethnic DNA. So I was asked a question recently. How could Zagor's DNA, how could we test his ET DNA? You can't, because it's not applicable. So even the testing process for channeling someone, it should be for channeling somebody who has had an Earth lifetime before, to trace if actually DNA changes through channeling somebody who's passed on but has had a previous lifetime on Earth. Then the genetics could change, like what happened with Alexander the Great's DNA. When Zagor and I were writing his DNA to see what the parts of it are, right? The Arcturian and the Syrian. So we were able to see that he had Arcturian and Syrian DNA. So, and human, of course. And when we had gone inside, energetically inside his body, to read the DNA, that's when that DNA transference happened of his human, Greek, Northern Macedonian, and Albanian DNA into Zagor crystal's genetic profile. That profile is still my profile, my human DNA, that got altered. But Zagor acts like a sort of like a proxy conduit for transferring DNA. So in a way, that's also his humanoid DNA profile now, with a bit of 2% Greek, Northern Macedonia, and Albania DNA. So in a sense, now it is his DNA as well. And I've learned that DNA can be programmable, and it can also be used as a source of energy transference if the right templates are set up. So taking several ethnic DNA characteristics from one body and transferring that into an extraterrestrial body that can process the energetic additions and add it onto another person's human DNA profile does not seem to be out of the realm of possibility. It's very much possible to do this, as has been done through Zagor, because he was inside Alexander's body, and so was I at the same time. And we were also touching the stasis pod that Alexander's body is in Alexander the Great's tomb. So, energy transference of humanoid DNA from Alexander got transferred through Zagor into Zagor crystal's human DNA profile that Zagor now has as a container to hold that Greece DNA, Northern Macedonian, and Albania DNA. He is the holding container for it. The DNA might be human, but he can do the transferences. He's an extraterrestrial. That's why he can transfer energetically. DNA sequencing, programming, DNA characteristics, traits, ethnicity, he can transfer that over from one human profile of genetics to another, like he has done. But I never tested ET DNA. But I signed up with Ancestry as Zagor Crystal, and Zagor is his own entity. He is extraterrestrial. But we needed to have 2 DNA kit profiles. One LK, which is me, and one Zagor Crystal to see if any changes would ever happen. And I'm glad Grant got me to do 2 DNA testing kits. One is me, LK profile, saliva swab before channeling, and one during channeling when I was channeling Zagor, another saliva swab. In the beginning, both DNA test results were the same, but after a year and a half, they changed since I went in my light body to Alexander the Great's tomb, and Zagor went with me, and we did that genetic profiling of Alexander the Great's body to see what genetic makeup he has in his system, because his body is alive. And people have asked me, why was his body being kept alive in the stasis pod in the sarcophagus when his soul is no longer in the body? It's being kept alive because he has been genetically engineered by Arcturians and Syrians. So he is like a demigod with the aspects and traits of those ETs. That's why his body has been well preserved and is still alive, to study those genetics. So this is very important. He is one of the most iconic living specimens with that type of a DNA profile to be in a tomb with his body still alive. And again, I don't think his soul will be coming back into that body. He told me his soul is not coming back into that body that's in the tomb. So it would have to be a different soul to come into that body to animate it fully, so that body will wake up and function with a different soul. But again, nobody can open the stasis pod unless they have a soul ready to come in and inhabit that body. So if anybody was ever to discover that tomb, like scientists or explorers or archaeologists, they don't know not to disturb the body because it's in stasis. They think you open the sarcophagus, open the stasis pod, and the guy will wake up and he will, be awake. No, his body is in stasis, but his soul is not inhabiting the body. Without the soul, that body will die. And his body was, again, being preserved this way because of its genetic profiling. It was genetically engineered to make him who he was. The strength, the superhuman memory, the agility,
the incredible warrior that he was. That is the genetic engineering components of the Arcturian and the Syrian DNA. So it's very, the body itself is the real treasure. The gold, the statues, the Ark of the Covenant that's also in that tomb under Jordan, those are all interesting artifacts, but his body is the biggest treasure in that tomb of Alexander the Great. At least to me it is, because of the genetic stuff. It's incredible.
So thank you so much and namaste.